German artists of the 16th century experienced a period of brilliant activity in the arts, which corresponds to the Italian High Renaissance almost exactly in time and duration. While knowledge of the advances in Italian art became common at this time, and certainly had an impact on German art, it was by no means a singular influence which fostered the German High Renaissance, if you will. As the Italian High Renaissance ended around 1527, so too did the German High Style end in 1530. Several factors contributed to the decline. Grunewald and Dürer died in 1528. Holbein would permanently settle in London, and Protestant iconoclasts destroyed much religious art of the past as a result of Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, and new work in the religious vein was not being commissioned. Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg was the most important artist of this period. Dürer's early training was as an apprentice to Michael Wulgment, whose shop produced everything from book illustrations in woodcut to altarpieces. Here Dürer became familiar with the many graphic techniques, printmaking, in which a major part of his fame lies. While Dürer's German birth and training account for a large part of his artistic vision, so too did his visits to Italy. He had direct contact with Giovanni Bellini in Venice and possibly Mantegna in Mantua. While these artists had a profound effect on Dürer, who saw his mission in life as bringing the new Italian concept of art to his fellow German artists, no less strong an influence was the effect Italian culture had on Dürer. Remembering the German preacher's admonishments that the end of the world was near, Dürer was shocked at the behavior in Venice which seemed to support this prophecy. On his return from his first trip to Venice, then, Dürer began work on a series of woodcuts that almost literally illustrated St. John's vision of the end of the world. This woodcut is entitled The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and Dürer demonstrates a remarkable virtuosity with the woodcut in a work whose power is reminiscent of Mantegna. Dürer made these woodcuts for public sale, one of the first instances in which an artist worked not on the basis of commission, but on speculation. In other words, Dürer made these woodcuts hoping that there would be a market for them, as opposed to knowing that he already had a buyer. These woodcuts were enormously successful in a Germany that was ripe for Reformation. As a result of these works in printmaking, Dürer's work was known and studied in almost every part of Europe by 1500. Man falls, story at 11. While a certain symbolism is evident in the fall of man and early engraving by Dürer, the most striking feature is the presence of figures clearly derived from classical models. These models were no doubt studied by Dürer in Italy. While the figures are ideal, the tension inherent in the very moment he chooses to represent them speaks of its German nature. When we contrast these figures with both Masaccio's Expulsion and Masolino's In the Garden paintings of Adam and Eve, we can see Dürer's discomfort with the world as he shows Adam and Eve at a critical juncture. One aspect of their lives is about to end, but it has not yet happened. This piece is highly reflective of the time it was made, and perhaps in many people's minds is even more relevant today. Unlike the Mannerists, Dürer sought to combine both the lessons from other artists and the lessons learned from observing nature, what are perhaps the most important lessons of all. So not only was Dürer an artist akin to Leonardo, he was writing a treatise on human proportion and physiognomy at the time of his death, he is also like Michelangelo in that he kept things in his eyes, as this landscape attests. Dürer's triumph here shows him to be master of another new media, that being watercolor, and Dürer's are among the first watercolors ever made. Dürer was also one of the first artists to be fascinated with his own image, as he left behind a series of self-portraits, the earliest of which was done when he was 13. Obviously, this is not that painting. Three things are immediately evident in viewing this self-portrait. He was a master of the new oil technique, in addition to being a master printmaker. Secondly, artists have achieved an exalted status, as this pose and portrayal suggest not Dürer, but Christ. And third, painting himself in this way reveals he had a rather high opinion of himself. Imagine that, an artist with a large ego. If we contrast Albrecht Dürer's work with that of another German artist from some 65 years prior, Stefan Lochner, it shows just how huge a jump German artists made at this time. Perhaps their growth in art is even greater than that of the Italians. Contrasting Dürer's portraits with those of the Italians shows the German artist to be one far more interested in probing the psychological nature of the subject. Dürer's Four Apostles, some 26 years later, shows that he was able to effectively join the forces of the two major characteristics of his life: a northern artist interested in psychology and minute detail and realism, with the formal, monumental quality of Italian painting. The success of Albrecht Dürer was not easily arrived at. This is a print entitled Melancholia I, and it's illustrative of the tremendous struggles he no doubt went through to reconcile the two different influences or aspects of his art. You need not read the title of this engraving to understand the image or its symbolism. Here is perhaps an artist tortured by an overabundance of ideas, unable to justify or act on any of them. As Dürer represented himself in his self-portrait as being almost godlike, so too does the artist often view himself as an imbecile. The pendulum swings both ways with great momentum, garnered from both his successes and his failures. Dürer's great contemporary was the artist Matthias Grunewald. The two artists could not have been more different, as powerful emotions poured forth from Grunewald's hand. His masterpiece was the Eisenheim altarpiece, shown closed in this slide. Now, while he may have traveled to Italy, Grunewald shows little concern for the classical figures of the High Renaissance. The bottom panel that's not seen here shows the entombment, and it makes clear that Grunewald's concern for form is to make an emotional impact. This idea is made even clearer in examining the crucifixion, easily one of the most powerful, discomforting scenes of the crucifixion ever painted. A 14th century mystic described the dead Christ in this way, and these are the words of St. Bridget of Sweden. The ribs protruded and could be counted. After the moisture was consumed, the stomach receded to the back. The crown of thorns was impressed on his head. It covered half the forehead. The blood flowed in many rills. Then the odor of death spread. After he had expired, the mouth gaped, so that spectators could see the tongue, the teeth, and the blood in the mouth. The eyes were cast down. The knees were bent to one side. The feet were twisted around the nails as if they were on hinges. The cramped fingers and arms were stretched. Like Durer, then, Grunewald reveals that he had an incredible ability to bring to life influential writings of the day. Opening the altarpiece reveals a fuller understanding of Grunewald's character, as he just as easily and powerfully described the good as the bad. It is a rare artist who is comfortable with two such radically opposed ideas. Think back to Piero's resurrection and compare it now to Grunewald's approach. Which image better illustrates the triumph of the soul over the body, or God over man, or perhaps God for man? Both Grunewald's crucifixion and resurrection are rendered all the more powerful because of the contrast between his different treatments of the two images. Grunewald understood that there is a unique solution to the problem of every image. He did not impose his will, and by that I mean style, on an image as Piero did. Piero's work was a formal success, while Grunewald's is a spiritual and formal success both. Another German artist of note from this period was Albrecht Altdorfer. Obviously trained as a miniaturist, Altdorfer was a Renaissance man in that he was a painter and architect who also served as a city councilor. Altdorfer turned down the job of mayor to do this work for a German duke who wanted it to arouse public awareness in the threat of the Ottoman East Empire. So inspirational in a military sense was this picture that Napoleon took it with him some 200 years after it was painted. Does the battle seem to be Altdorfer's major concern in this painting? Not particularly, as the inscription's inclusion in the sky is most telling. Perhaps the patron, or the artist, felt compelled to tell the viewers what the main subject was, as it seems to get confused. Is the purpose of the painting to illustrate a battle, or to depict a fantastic landscape in which a battle just happens to be taking place? Altdorfer is credited with the first pure landscapes of the Western world, and certainly revealed that interest in this painting. The third and last major German painter of this period was Hans Holbein, perhaps the major portraitist of this time. Unlike Dürer and Grunewald, Holbein contributes to the end of the German high period of painting by leaving Germany to become the court painter of Henry VIII in England, seen in this portrait. This is the French Ambassadors, also by Holbein, and this painting is loaded with symbolism, and the interests of the men that he depicted fill the room. Yet this does not represent the full spectrum of the symbolism in this painting. The anamorphic, or deliberately distorted, representation of a skull in the foreground is a caution against the sin of vainglory as neither man in the painting can see it properly from his position. It is made much more clear by looking at the painting from the lower left corner at very close range. Again, keep in mind that this piece was done after Holbein's move to London and that his subsequent influence in Germany would have been minimal. For the most part, the roles of Germany and the Netherlands switched during the 16th century. Artists of the Netherlands were no longer the influential ones, as in the 15th century. They were now the influenced. Dürer traveled there in 1520, seeking patronage, but also no doubt to see the work of masters who had influenced him. His classical interests were picked up now by the Netherlandish painters as they learned Italian through a German. What a difference a century makes. Jan Gossart, also called Mabuse, was one of the first Romanists, and this was a term used to describe Flemish artists who visited Italy and fell under the spell of Michelangelo. His work shows the influence not only of the Italian masters, but also Dürer and his Netherlandish predecessors in his uniting the figures with the landscape. The greatest Flemish painter of the 16th century was Peter Bruegel. While trained as a Romanist like Gossart, Bruegel was not knocked out by the Italian classical style of the day, as seen here in his Hunters in the Snow. Like the Limbourg brothers, Bruegel worked on a series of paintings based on the months of the year. Unlike the Limbourg brothers, however, he subordinates the figures to the moods of nature. In fact, the strongest influence of Italy on Bruegel's work was the series of landscape drawings he made of the Alps on his journeys, which informed the landscape we see here. Bruegel observed both nature and man as fuel for his work, and is no doubt the better artist for it, as his is a name well thought of today. Often emphasized in discussions of Bruegel's work is his satirical nature, yet his biographer indicated that he liked to attend peasant celebrations and wear their native dress in order to mix. His peasant wedding that we see here, like his other works, avoids the psychology of the figures. Bruegel apparently saw life in the common definition of his time: all men, one man. Shall we dance? Bruegel painted both serious and comic sides of life, without belittling it or romanticizing it, for that matter. His wedding dance has an incredible vitality that seems to not be the view of a detached outsider, but an enjoying participant. Why then this less than sterling reputation in his day? Perhaps Peter the Droll's reputation was largely a result of his contemporaries' expectations. Not all apples painted are meant to suggest the expulsion from paradise. Yet what could a man expect whose last work was this parable of the blind? And you see that they do indeed all fall into the ditch. Sixteenth century French art was still relatively unimportant. Jean Clouet's portrait of Francis I reveals an interest in things superficial, as splendor and elegance take precedence over form. Even the king's head is subordinate to the finery of his garment. The erotic nature of Francis's taste is easily grasped. One can see here someone who revels in pleasures of the flesh without concern for consequences or larger issues. Perhaps Jean Clouet is not incompetent if he's able to make this suggestion readily apparent. The Renaissance in Spain focuses basically on the work of one man from Greece who received his training in Venice, and also apparently visited Rome before settling in Spain in 1577. Titian's vivid color and Tintoretto's dramatic lighting influenced his work, which also displays Mannerist tendencies. The man we're talking about here is El Greco. And El Greco was a supremely self-confident artist who once offered to revamp The Last Judgment, saying Michelangelo couldn't paint. El Greco's masterpiece that we see here is his Burial of Count Orgaz. The painting continues the rich tradition of works which include both depictions of heaven and earthbound figures. El Greco was a painter of unquestioned ability. Look at the gold robes of the saints in the foreground. But he often put that ability aside to make the emotional focus of his work the center of our attention. Laocoon is an example of one of El Greco's mythological works, and it's highly expressive of the terror of this story. The color used in the figures recalls El Greco's statement that he despised walking in the sunlight because the daylight blinds the light within. He sounds like a crazy artist who would have thought even I had a nice tan. El Greco's work is characterized by exciting compositions. Jackson Pollock, in fact, did many studies and drawings from his work. In this painting, the integration of the figures into the landscape and the animated clouds make for a particularly exciting image. Those same animated clouds are also seen in his View of Toledo, a luminous, dramatic, and evocative landscape if ever there was one. Both Laocoon and View of Toledo show why some textbooks regard El Greco as a Mannerist. Let's look for a moment now at El Greco's portrait work. And El Greco's portrait of his friend Father Hortensio is one of the great portraits of all time. Not to be exalted for being a great likeness in physical terms, it is superb in that it defines El Greco's very genius and aim, that of revealing the inside. One senses a spirited, quick-witted man intensely interested in the work of his friend, the painter. I'm not sure whether this is the vision of a saint, as Gardner's text suggests. Perhaps it's a man we'd like to see a saint, because he is anything but remote. Well, let's wrap up the Northern Renaissance now. Major artists of the 16th century outside of Italy included Dürer, Grunewald, Bruegel, and El Greco, as we've just seen. Now, their contemplation of the problem of leaving the Renaissance led to many different solutions, which in many ways led to the international age of art called the Baroque, which we will study next.